We are all familiar with the Holocaust. If you held just a minute of silence for each and every victim, the silence would last for 11.4 years. It was the systemic, state-sponsored genocide of over 6 million people by one singular authoritarian regime. That was in the 1940s. Today, there are over 80 regimes killing 25 times more. Thus, Team 1096 proudly affirms the resolution. Our sole argument is our sword and shield. Our first subpoint is our sword. The Council on Foreign Relations, just 2 months ago, did a detailed report of the democratic status of the modern world order. For the 20th consecutive year, human rights have declined. Authoritarian regimes are working together to cement their control. From the standpoint of a democratic country with resources others could only dream of, intervention is not just policy choice, but rather a moral obligation. Luckily, Carbonaro from just this year explains the resolution's usage of the word force can be realized in 5 key ways. First, the US can back grassroots protests, providing resources to the oppressed peoples directly in order to replace their dictators. Second, the CIA can stage government coups from within institutions. Third, the US military can use full-scale invasions, for example, like on Nazi Germany. Fourth, the US can provide air power and intelligence to neighboring countries, thereby orchestrating indirect removal. Fifth, and most recently, extraction operations can be used to dethrone the kingpin without any casualties. The negative will inevitably claim that operations have failed, but history shows otherwise. William Novicos of Yale University found that more than 76% of US regime changes fostered lasting democratic transitions. That is why force can be necessary. First is by deterring destruction. Professor Tanya Glasser of Amherst College finds that the possibility of regime change is the ultimate deterrent against authoritarian regimes, whose leaders must now think twice before committing atrocities to avoid retaliation. Professor Yu furthers, the threat of American force has single-handedly averted major crises worldwide, discouraging a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, preventing renewed conflict in Korea, and constraining Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons. Countering authoritarianism is critical. As Alex Wall of Tufts University explains, that regime change is the only long-term solution to prevent atrocities. The reason is simple. What Lowe of Emory University explains is that by exiling the leaders likely to restart conflict and replacing them with peaceful democratic factions, democracies like the US are able to preemptively prevent a power vacuum from occurring, empirically proven in places like Italy, Germany, Afghanistan, and Japan. Second is by empowering diplomacy. As Diplo explains that while America always looks to peaceful solutions first, Professor Alexander George of Stanford University finds diplomacy is only credible to adversaries when backed by threat of force. Every success of US diplomacy from Panama to Grenada credits America's willingness to use force in defense of freedom. In fact, Professor Michael Weaver of the US Air Force explains that diplomacy must work hand in hand with military force, as without it, adversaries have no incentive to negotiate nor compromise. And history proves, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy relied on military strength to force the Soviet Union to the table, de-escalating the crisis and saving millions. Our second subpoint is our shield. The resolution does not specify foreign authoritarians, but rather all authoritarians, including those inside the US. When an active president abuses their power via treason, bribery, or other crimes, it can be removed by force via a process known as impeachment. Through this process, Congress has the power to put presidents on trial and remove them from the office. As our Randall evidence finds, the impeachment process is the cornerstone of the American checks and balance system that defines our democracy. No matter what dictator, foreign or domestic, it is our moral obligation to both resist and condemn their atrocities. Thus, Team 1096 is so proud to affirm.
Ultimately, history is the best test of a country's intent. And when we look at the history of the United States and its removal of authoritarian leaders, it has been one failure after another. Thus, we negate resolve. The United States is justified in using force to remove authoritarian leaders. Our first argument is intentions. Whitson 23 finds that foreign policy is the least democratic of all US government policies, remote from the interests and concerns of the general electorate and with little accountability. Unfortunately, the fact is that advocacy designed to shape US foreign policy based on evidence stands little chance against the siren calls of dollars from lobbyists and foreign governments. Looking to today, Kramer 26 finds that the same oil companies whose stock prices soared following Maduro's capture were the same companies that started pouring millions of dollars into lobbying just a year ago. And this constant lobbying is incredibly detrimental. Harvard 22 explains that unelected organizations not legitimized by votes warp norms in ways which concentrate power among the wealthy and stifle opposition. Thus, not only has the process been corrupted, but preserving this justification encourages more lobbying in the future, a constant feedback loop continually eroding democratic norms. DeSlat 20 quantifies why this is terrible because it finds that when the people don't trust our government, it can't function effectively, and basic risk becomes existential. And past the United States' overbearing private sector, the incentives that we have in intervening and resolving these conflicts are inherently hypocritical and unjustified. Downes 11 explains the paradox of intervention. While the United States preaches democracy, the only way to get rid of a dictator is to bring a different minority population to power. Thus, intervening forces try to put their preferred leader in charge, but they often don't understand the target country's politics or the backlash their choice may create. Regime change usually fails to create democracy because interveners often benefit from installing leaders they can control, not leaders who can actually command a nation. And this matters because justification depends on motive. The evidence shows that regime change is often pursued to advance these special interests, not democracy. And as a result, interventions are designed around profit and political gain rather than long-term stability, which helps to explain why they so often fail to actually create lasting change in the first place. Contention 2 is just war. Because even if we disregard the issues with the United States specifically, removal of authoritarian leaders by force in general is unjustified. Because in the context of military action, justification is not some vague moral sentiment. It is governed by just war theory. And a core non-negotiable tenet of this framework is the probability of success. Because if an action has little to no chance of actually achieving a lasting, peaceful outcome, then to try to do the same thing again and again is completely unjustified. Because when autocrats create systems that consolidate and centralize authority across their country, the regime and system don't just disappear with their death. We just see new autocrats take their place. Recently with Iran, we killed the Ayatollah and now there's a new one. Israel killed the leader of Hamas many, many times, and yet there was always a new one. The list goes on and on. This is why removing a leader structurally fails to create lasting change. In fact, Richburg continues that it often makes it worse, with the newer leaders having a deeper hatred and vengeance against the United States. So even when we try to establish a new regime and prevent the successor from taking power, we still fail. Downes in Mountain 12 concludes that regime change almost always fails to build a lasting democracy as newly installed leaders are viewed as illegitimate. That's because when the United States installs whichever leader we think is best, we undermine the exact democratic processes that we are trying to create in these nations. That's why Monson 12 continues that interventions by democratic states are no more likely to result in democratic improvement when compared against interventions conducted by authoritarian regimes. In fact, Downes even finds that removal triples the chance of civil war, and Thrall 17 that a whopping 19-fold increase in terrorism directly resulted from US intervention. Ultimately, given that the violent removal of a dictator almost guarantees institutional collapse rather than actual lasting peace, it completely fails the criterion of just war theory. Judges, true justification requires both right intentions and a real chance of success. Unfortunately, a policy driven by special interests at home that routinely results in chaos abroad meets neither standard. Thus, please negate. Thanks.
No, your thoughts?
Yeah.
Just explain this lobbying argument. Explain this lobbying argument you made.
Yeah, sure. So basically what we're telling you is that a large portion of motivations for the United States intervening in these places is lobbying. Because I want to call attention to something you said, right?
Yeah.
You're like, yeah, there's so many issues going on in all these different countries around the world. And we agree, that's definitely true. So then the question becomes, why is the United States selective in the places that we choose to intervene? The answer, because the countries that we choose to intervene are the ones that either special interests at home or foreign lobbyists abroad are lobbying for us to intervene into.
So just to clarify, when it comes to what the definition of justification is, you seem to give kind of two different positions. One, you say that we should look at whether or not it's possible to actually create lasting effects.
Yeah.
And second, you say we should look at the intents. Which is more important?
We'd say that they're both pretty important. I mean, I'd say that yeah,
so for the
really I'd
premise
say
of
they're both
debate,
important.
do we have to win that the US's intent is good, or that the effects are good?
I mean, we don't tell you exactly what you have to win. I'm sure you could tell us what you think you want. You need to win, but yeah. Okay, awesome. So let's talk about diplomacy. Can you give me an example of the United States effectively using this diplomacy to create a more stable outcome?
Yeah, I believe we actually mentioned it from Pena and Grenada. We think that they got better because the only way they could actually change was when America used a threat, a force, which then allowed diplomacy and conversations to happen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I guess let's talk about this argument made on this, just war theory.
Sure.
If we win that, even if the US might have some ill intents in terms of wanting to do more lobbying, it still also wants to pursue democracy, and it is able to create some democracies in some areas, such as our study shows 76% of the time. Would that be justified?
Sure. So, I mean, we kind of disagree with that premise, right? I think if we go and look at all the different examples, we would argue that the United States generally doesn't have that effect. But anyway, what we would tell you is the definition of justified is having a reasonable basis for doing something. So we would argue that the basis, insofar as it's not good, we would disagree with it being justified.
So okay, cool. You You have a question.
Awesome. So let's talk about moral obligation, right? I want to ask you this specifically, right? If the United States has this moral obligation to intervene in all the places where genocides are occurring, why haven't they?
Well, we're not here to debate whether or not what the U.S. should have done in the past. Rather, we're saying, is the use of force a good thing, and should we keep it as an option?
But I think what the United States has or hasn't done is really important, because when we analyze the United States as an actor, that's really important.
So when we analyze whether or not the U.S.'s use of force is justified, we look at what it has done, not what it could have done. We're not saying, if anything, those genocides you talk about are reasons the affirmative is a good idea. The fact that they could have used force in these areas and helped stop the genocides is probably a reason why the use of force is a good option, and a reason why the judges should vote affirmative.
Wait, because what we're trying to explain, right, is that first of all, we disagree with the premise that the United States actually helps reduce conflict as, but also the fact is, if the United States chose not to intervene in the areas where they say, oh, genocide was happening, so we should have done it, the question remains, why didn't they? Because if we're analyzing the United States as an actor, we have to analyze both what they did and what they didn't.
No, we're analyzing whether their use of force was justified.
The Aff also believes that you should be evaluating this round through intentions and consequences. The Aff believes that the resolution asks you to determine if the use of force was justified or not, and that the aftermath was good or bad. That's dependent on their two contentions, which we'll have responses to. First, on intentions. We'll say that most presidents want democracy and have advocated for democracy. They are democratically elected, and when they do regime changes, nearly every single president has gone out and said that they want democracy. Bush, when he intervened in Libya, said he was doing it for the good of democracy. Two, American elites want democracy. That's good for profit. So if they win the fact that profit is the primary incentive for American elites, if we win that regime changes are good for profit, that is on net and Aff ballot. First, in autocratic or unstable regimes, businesses face the risk of assets being seized after trade. Two, in democracies, there's less business corruption and there's less overall control by authoritarian leaders. Three, state-controlled capitalist markets are harder to trade in and they're more common in authoritarian countries because the state gets to regulate which goods pass in and pass out, which free enterprise markets don't. Four, autocratic regimes and dictatorships can alter laws or impose taxes on a whim due to their irrational solo style, which means that they are able to reduce restrictions on trade whenever they want. And look at China and the US. All of a sudden, China would place sanctions on the United States, and that would cause trade wars to happen, which is obviously bad for American elites. Five, it's harder to express yourself and innovate in authoritarian countries due to intellectual repression, which is bad for innovation, which overall decks the global economy and is worse. Then, even if we want to, now we can argue that regime changes have good intention in the first place. Zelaya in Nicaragua, Bolsheviks in the Russian Civil War, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Noriega in Panama, Gaddafi in Libya. All of these were evil dictators that created multiple harmful environments in their countries that caused the U.S. to want to intervene. And every single president who has decided to do a regime change has said that those are evil actors and that we need to stop them. Instability, or their second argument. One, in the most holistic analysis analyzing almost 200 years of intervention, Nomikos in 2014 finds that when solely looking at cases where regime change was facilitated to promote democracy, only 6 out of 63 resulted in instability. The reason is simple. What Lowe of Emory University explains is that by exiling the leaders likely to restart conflict and replacing them with peaceful, democratic factions, democracies like the US are able to preemptively prevent instability from occurring. It's just empirically proven in places like Italy, Germany, and Japan. Again, even if there have been a few instances where intervention hasn't been perfect, you could not let that be indicative of a broader trend. All of the Neg's examples are cherry-picked evidence that are included in our Nomikos analysis, but the overall trend is still an Aff ballot. Two, the U.S. selectively replaces authoritarians with peaceful, democratic leaders and removes factions that would start a civil war by imprisoning said leaders and exiling them, which is empirically what they did in Germany and Japan. Three, the U.S. also forces them to change their laws to renounce war in order to ensure compliance, which is what they did to Italy, Germany, and Japan, which causes preconditions that allow democracy to thrive, which takes out the entirety of their argument. Four, instability turns into peace into the long term. The Journal of Comparative Economics concludes in a holistic study that there is no permanent effect of temporary interventions. After the interventions end, its effects fade away rapidly. And five, it's easy to look at botched operations and conclude forced removal of leaders amounts to disaster. But the question that needs to be asked is not what happens when we act, but what happens when we don't. Inaction in Rwanda caused a genocide that killed 800,000 people. 6 million died in the Holocaust while the West tried to find peaceful solutions. resolutions. The decision to remove a leader by force is only made when other options are doomed to failure or have already been exhausted, therefore being justified. The odds are already stacked against us, but attempting to do something is better than inaction that guarantees suffering. Go back.
You ready? This rebuttal speech is a call for our opponents to read the resolution. First, let's define the word justified. Merriam-Webster says justified means having or shown to have a just, right, or reasonable basis for their actions. What does that mean? Everything they tell you is what the U.S. has caused. Isolated examples of where the U.S. might have created some successes. Never in their case do they tell you why the United States went into these things. The only thing that they tell you is the United States went in just to create democracy. But we'll get to that. Insofar as we win, that the underlying intentions for all of these actions are unjust and are not right, we win this debate because that's what justified means. Our second intention on just war showed how when we don't have the right intentions, we don't get the best results every single time. But that's why you focus on our contention one, first. Go to what they concede about the Whitson 23 evidence, where we tell you that lobbyists have unduly control over the United States foreign policy sector because there's less checks and balances. That's really key, because when our Parliament 22 evidence tells you that consolidates power within the elite, and then our DePasquale evidence tells you that when these lobbyists control the government, we can't forecast other existential risks like climate change and this, that's the biggest impact you're going to be voting off of this round. Let's go on to the specific things they tell you. On the laundry list of things they tell you in our case, they tell you some things that we improved. They say, okay, we improved the economy, but insofar as that was not the original intention of the United States, to go and improve everybody's economy, you're gonna look to that. Why? Look to examples like Haiti, where when we went and overthrew Haiti, when we established our new leader, we said, hey, you're only allowed to stay here if you lower your tariffs on rice. So then we flooded their rice markets and collapsed their entire economy. Then, let's go to Noriega. They tell you that Panama was a success. What they don't tell you is that Noriega was our literal employee because we were paying him. Why? This is the thesis of our case. When the thesis of the first contention is that the US goes to all these countries to exert control and not to create democracy and not for humanitarian reasons, their intention is wrong. Because helping yourself out and helping your own country is the duty of a country. That's why we build public schools. That's not why we remove the leaders of other countries altogether. Now, let's get into their case. Let's start with to talk about World War II. This is a really terrible example because what was successful in World War II? The all-out invasion we did of with the Allied powers, or the fact that we removed the leader. Judge, what we're telling you is the resolution again says removed authoritarian leaders. They can't tell you that everything else we did there is inextricably connected. In fact, our Britannica evidence finds it wasn't even the United States who removed Hitler. What's key is when they tell you all of these examples of the 5 different types of force, they can't tell you whether removing the leader is uniquely specific to any of these things. They try to paint a picture where the United States is great and perfect. Not only do we contend that, but this debate is solely about removing authoritarian leaders by force. So when they talk about protests and these CIA coups, insofar as it wasn't the United States who removed the leader by force, you're not going to go there. And when we're using the word force in the first place, the Department of War of the United States makes it really clear. It's the Army, it's the Marine Corps, it's the Navy, it's the Air Force. It's not this very same diplomacy that they talk about. Then, let's go onto their Yale and Nomikos evidence. This is really clear here, because this is when we went and created democracy. What they don't tell you is half the examples are the countries that Germany occupied during World War II, so of course they went and returned to a democracy. But was it because they were a democracy beforehand, or was it because of the United States? We tell you it was because it was a democracy beforehand. And then when they tell you about these examples in Afghanistan, what they don't tell you is that the Afghanistani people actually preferred the Taliban over the government that we went and instilled there. That's because they always preferred the United States over them when it came to these trials. Judge, here's the thesis of our case. They can honestly win every single thing they're saying, that the United States has done these terrible things. But insofar as their reasons are wrong, they aren't successful most of the time. That's like Denison 20 finds that out of 28 cases, only 3 have proved successful. And in all these cases, like Panama and Libya and Syria, we still see instability. Judge, this debate is about the basis of our actions. And when the basis of our actions is control, it's just not justified.
You're staking the round on the fact that the justification for US intentions is profit, correct?
No, I think it's lots of things, right? So profit could be very well is one of the things. Let's go into the lots of reasons that we talk about our case. First is not profit of the government, it's profit of the companies that control the government. And we tell you that these oil companies have never preached democracy, maybe like the United States. Then, even when we talk about the United States specifically, we say that we install pliable dictators. That's because we want control. We don't want to build these countries.
So if the next leader that we see is coming to power won't be favorable to the United States, we're not going to let it happen. But when we install leaders that are better for the United States and not better for their own people, that's where you see that the just cause, and it's just not justified.
Okay, let's dive into the intentions debate a little bit more.
Yeah, sure.
Right? So you say it's the company's profit, right? Why would companies want an authoritarian regime? Like why would they want global authoritarianism?
I think they want oil. Like, look to Venezuela, right? Like, we're not saying that every time that these countries intervene because global authoritarianism, right? We can see that there are some examples where the U.S. was successful in creating some lasting peace. But
That's
our
not my question.
argument is really, really specific
Again,
when it
that's
comes
not
to
my question.
Venezuela.
That's not my
That
question.
oil prices, oil stocks soared 20%.
Look, you have dropped a whole laundry list of reasons
Sure.
that flip your logic against you, right? I said in my last speech, I spent about a minute on this.
Yeah.
I spent a minute on me saying that, sure, they can have profit as their intention. They can have control as their intentions. But at the end of the day, if they want democracy, which is what we justified and you have dropped, then at the end of the day,
Yeah.
their intentions are still justified to cause a regime change.
But you're
You can have a
saying-
question.
You're saying
We've spent a minute 50 on this.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I can have a question. So can you tell me why we had like the leader of Panama as our employee?
I need evidence for that. Like,
Sure,
You just said,
CIA,
okay, sure, Noriega is a
Manuel-
U.S. employee.
Manuel
Evidence.
Antonio Noriega was only taken
Evidence.
off the CIA payroll in 1977. That's because since we installed him to do our bidding, we paid him every single year a salary because we wanted control. Yeah, Panama is an example where it did turn to a democracy, but then why did we need to pay him to lead his own country?
Don't see the relevance here.
The
because-
relevance is the U.S. wanted control, not democracy for Panama. They wanted control of Panama. And then the second that Noriega was like, wait a minute, I don't want to do what the U.S. is saying, in 1977, guess what? The CIA funding got cut, right? So yeah, sure, there still is a democracy. But when we read the definition of justified, and we look to what the dictionary definition means, and what the topic is asking us to evaluate, we see that on the whole, even in the examples where we do create democracy, that was never our main intention, because there's all these little additives.
Do you think this topic should be evaluated on balance?
I think this topic should be evaluated on what it says it is, justified and
So
resolved.
how do
If
you?
it was on balance,
so,
resolution
okay,
would have said on
that's
balance.
a perfect question, right? Like, if you have one example where it's not justified and one example where it's justified,
It's gonna
how do you
be-
break the clash? You obviously vote for the side that has more justification, which we have, because you drop every other example.
Alright.
The most important argument in this round is our first subpoint of our sword. When authoritarian leaders are allowed to remain in power unchecked, innocent people suffer and die. Human rights have declined for the 20th consecutive year, and authoritarian regimes are starting to pursue nuclear weapons to expand their reign. Through extraction operations and invasions, which are included under my opponent's definition of force, U.S. intervention is necessary to stop millions from dying. They tell you that justified means having a reasonable basis for action. Realize that this simply strengthens our argument. When the U.S. sees authoritarian countries causing human rights abuses, it wants to stop them and promote democracy, proving that they always have a reason for action. They say that bad intentions equal bad results, and the U.S. starts with bad intentions. But look at Shaurya's analysis rebuttal that American elites want profits, which occur for democracy. They drop a laundry list of reasons. When a company sees authoritarian regimes, they see that businesses face risk of their assets being seized, they see more businesses, corruption and control, they see an increased amount of trade blocks, and they see these regimes altering laws and imposing taxes. All things that these U.S. elites hate, which my opponents do not respond to. Their only response is that the American elites want oil and resources, but our argument is that they access them better through democracies, proving that the intentions and impacts of U.S. intervention are always good, as they all want a lasting democracy. Now for some weighing. Our argument comes first on magnitude, as authoritarian countries thrive on violent wars, which means at worst wars occur in both worlds, but there is a chance that U.S. intervention can restore democracy, making it try or die for the Aff because of the Nomico study, which I'll talk about later. Our argument also solves for the entirety of their impacts, as well as the civil wars and instability that they say U.S. intervention causes are only an issue because the authoritarian regimes ignite them in the first place. When it comes to their arguments, there are a couple of problems that were not properly addressed in their rebuttal. First, through a study of the last 200 years of U.S. intervention, only 6 out of 63 cases resulted in a civil war of further instability. Our Nomicos and low pieces of evidence are much better than theirs, as they isolate cases where a regime change was done to overthrow an authoritarian, which is what today's resolution is about. showing that 75% of said operations created a stable and lasting democracy, which supercharges our magnitude claims as proves that we have a very high chance of actually creating change. Instability is not an issue, as the US selectively replaces authoritarians with stable democratic leaders exiling and imprisoning authoritarian factions that attempt to rise to power, and by forcing compliance with laws historically seen in Italy, Germany, and Afghanistan, proving that history sides with the affirmative. More than that, the Journal of Comparative Economics Evidence Read and Rebuttal finds that the negative effects of US intervention fade away rapidly, proving that when it comes to the long-term effects of US intervention, they always go to the Aff. Finally, in that you must realize that Shaurya's analysis from rebuttal will not respond to that inaction is always worse than inaction. We've seen during the Rwanda genocide that they axed across that we could have used force to make it better. However, we did not do that, proving that force is always justified to stop these horrible crimes from happening. You must remember that the question of this debate is not if force is perfect, but rather if force should remain an option, and the answer is a clear yes.
The easiest place for you to begin this round is our argument about intentions. They can see that the definition of justified is for someone to have a just and reasonable basis for action. So, if they win that the United States' intention is to create democracy and improve these countries in every scenario in which they get involved, then they can win this round. But they drop every single piece of evidence and warranting that we tell you, which explains why they don't want to do this. Let's get into it. What we tell you is that with our wits and evidence, the United States foreign policy is the least democratic of U.S. policy because there's little accountability from the rest of the people. It's very driven by the executive branch, and because of that, it allows for extensive lobbying by special interests and foreign lobby groups. Look to Venezuela, look to Iraq, look to all these examples of this happening. This lobby is incredibly detrimental. Not only does it create these bad incentives, but when we preserve this justification, it creates a feedback loop of continually eroding democratic norms in the United States by encouraging more lobbying in the first place. And next, because our incentives are hypocritical, that means that empirically it doesn't work. When we try and replace these leaders without actually trying to strive for democracy in these places most of the time, the people see that we are being hypocritical. That's why these interventions oftentimes don't do what they are intended to do. Okay, their responses are twofold. One, they try and tell you that, oh, most presidents want democracy, most of them want to do this, and two, it's better for the economy and for these lobbyists if these countries aren't authoritarian. But my partner gives you really great examples of how this just isn't true. For example, look to Haiti, which they don't respond to. We tell you that the United States, in exchange for overthrowing the authoritarian leader, directly said to Haiti, you need to lower your rice tariffs. In exchange, we flooded the country with cheap rice, destroyed their agricultural production, and made them poor to this day. Clearly, the United States was not aiming to create a stable place. They were aiming to make it easier for our rice companies to make profit. Or look to Venezuela and Iraq. We did not immediately create democracy in these places. In Venezuela, we have left the vice president and most of the regime in power, specifically so that we can continue to extract oil. Clearly, the incentive is not for us to create democracy. They try and give you this idea of, oh, it's easier for these corporations to make money in a democracy. Clearly that's not true, because if the dictator prefers the United States to everyone else, that makes it even easier for them to make profit as opposed to anything else. This is all from rebuttal. Okay, now on to the weighing. First, it's not try or die because there's no actual policy action that the Aff is telling us to do. That doesn't really make any sense. But anyway, because intentions are a prerequisite, you can immediately vote there. Not only that, but we tell you, conceded from our case, that the lobbying that is created by this is completely an existential risk. When, insofar as they can see that far outweighing on magnitude anything that they tell you, the weighing is clean for us. Okay, let's go on to their case. They try and tell you, oh, the United States wants to do this, all of this, but insofar, again, as the incentives aren't there, it just doesn't make any sense. And every single time that they tell you, oh, the force worked, all of this stuff, keep in mind what the actual context was. For example, with Germany and Japan, was it the actual removal of the dictator, or was it the all-out invasion, the occupation for 20 years, the complete restructuring of their school system, everything else that the United States did? Obviously, it was this that actually made the change, as opposed to other countries in which we just removed the dictator and then didn't do anything else to actually change it. So clearly, even when the United States saw actual positive results, it was only because of external things that aren't inextricably connected with removing the leader. It's a clear vote for the negative.
Good for cross.
Yeah.
I want you to read me anything you said in any speech as to why lobbying is essential. You simply asserted it as a claim.
It's like the
Why is this a full argument?
Sure. Yeah, slap 20 says that.
No, I want you to
it.
repeat what you said in summary. You said, quote, they dropped that lobbying is existential, we outweigh magnitude. Why?
Yeah, we tell you that, like, look.
No,
No,
you tell us
I
why.
don't want what the evidence says. I want what you said in summary as to why lobbying is
Well, I think you guys
existential.
heard what we said in summary. Would you like us to repeat it?
So just to clarify, the only thing you said
I
was
want
lobbying
your
is essential.
partner to say exactly what he said in summary about why lobbying is existential.
I extended what our case said from the beginning, which has been unresponded to, which is that lobbying is an existential risk. That's what I said.
I mean,
That's what
it's
you said.
really clear. When he was talking about feedback loops, when we see these feedback loops of, look, all these companies continue to control the United States government, that's when we see basic risk become existential because our government doesn't function as well as it usually
So
does.
the problem was that was not a rate. Like explain it all. All you said was a feedback loop of continually
Okay,
eroding
I
the
mean, I
democratic
think that
norms.
just comes down to what the judge heard and what the judge
Sure.
took notes on,
You
and
guys
we're
know.
happy with whatever they heard, so, okay. Yeah. Can we take a question?
Yeah.
Okay. Koby, do you have one? Okay. So I think I have one. So can you tell me, like, you said in these countries when they're creating democracies, like, you said like they help them like change their laws, right?
Oh no. Well, oh yeah, yeah. So our argument is
Yeah.
that the U.S. could force compliance, empirically has been so in Italy, Germany, and Afghanistan.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Can I ask you a
That's
question?
perfect. Yeah. You can make a question.
So I guess let's talk about what you said. No, sorry. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I guess let's talk about this thing you say about the U.S. Or this authoritarian countries being better for the U.S. because they would help them get profits.
Sure.
If they're better for the U.S., why would they ever intervene in these?
Wait, if the authoritarian countries are better for the U.S., I
I
don't
don't think that's why they
understand.
would intervene.
Yeah, I can explain. What I said, if it wasn't clear, what I said is that, yeah, obviously the authoritarian regimes that we're overthrowing are good for the United States, but the incentive structure to replace one authoritarian with a different one who is pro-US is there, because then they're just biased towards the United States and everything.
And
Comes to
I think you're
economy
missing
and
the
everything
pieces of our argument. We said that if you prove that the United States' intentions going into these places was to save the economy of the countries they were going into and to bring peace and stability by removing the authoritarian leader, not that if you prove that's what happened, but if you prove that that's what the original intention was,
Wait,
that's what the
actually,
basis for the intervention
I
was,
guess-
you would win.
So
we
here's
already
the
made that
question. We
distinction.
talked a lot about how you need good intentions for things to work. If
We
we win
don't-
that their economies have gone better, even without good intentions, aren't we
No.
still proving that we don't need intentions
No,
to work?
because that's
Why-
not what the word justified means, right? This is a conceded definition I read in rebuttal, and what the topic that NSDA picked for NSDA
If we do an analysis
today.
as to why democracy and pursuing democracy is a good thing for these American elites.
Sure, it can be a good thing, but it's just not the resolution. Like,
Yeah, no, but
that's
is it,
what
yeah,
I called.
I'm not saying it's resolution, I'm saying it's their intent when they go into countries.
But it's not their intent, right? If you
Okay,
win that
that's-
that's their
that's
intent,
fine.
you can win this debate for sure.
Everyone good? Awesome. The question of this round isn't whether force has costs. It does. The question is whether allowing authoritarian oppression to continue is preferable. We prove that in cases where peaceful measures fail, force can be a justified last resort to protect human rights, restore self-determination, and prevent greater harms. When you're casting your ballot, remember that your role is not to decide that all interventions have been successful, but rather is the principle of intervention sound. Imagine a world with no alternative to authoritarianism, because they do not provide a successful alternative. Imagine a world with millions more dead. This is the world that the negative defends. The biggest point of clash in this whole debate is, are the US's intentions good or not? We can agree that the US has hidden incentives such as profit and control, but you must ask yourself, what is the primary incentive? The answer is a resounding democracy. We flipped them on their heads earlier in this debate and they dropped it. Authoritarian regimes are far worse for profit and control because they impose trade restrictions, employ restrictive state-controlled capitalism, foster an environment of harmful intellectual repression, increase asset seizure, and have mass business corruptions. Therefore, the businesses that they say are in the US that are so important to overall decision-making want democracy because they don't want negative economic impacts that happen in authoritarian countries. Therefore, the US's intentions in this round are democracy. Let's look at their responses. First, they say that US foreign policy isn't democratic. One, this wasn't in rebuttal. And two, it doesn't matter because the intention is still democracy. Two, they say incentives are hypocritical. This is not a mutually exclusive thing. There's layers to this onion of intentions. Three, they say that there's a Haiti empiric. But one, this was also not a frontline in rebuttal. And two, this empiric is an example of a hidden intention under the primary intention of democracy. You look at this on balance. Do we have an intention of democracy? Yes. They say in summary that if we win, that you should vote on democracy, then you vote there. Win. One, magnitude. Our argument comes first on magnitude as authoritarian countries thrive on violent wars, which means at worst, wars occur in both worlds, but there's a chance US intervention can restore democracy because they dropped the Nomikos evidence in the last speech that says that only 6 of 63 resulted in instability, so the Aff has a risk of saving more lives. They say no try or die, but this is the risk of offense magnitude weighing, not try or die weighing, which was just a form of rhetoric that we use, so the response doesn't even work because they just responded to the rhetoric, not what we actually said. They say lobbying is existential, but there's no warrant summary as to why lobbying is existential. Hold the line.
Let's look to the one thing I asked in rebuttal. Let's look to the resolution. When the resolution uses the word justified, not like other PF resolutions talk about should or any other words, we see that what we are evaluating is the basis, why we went there in the first place. And unfortunately, the fact is that the primary reason was not for democracy. In fact, they can even win that the US should intervene in these places, and that creates a net benefit. But if they cannot win, that was their initial intention, and that's the reason why they were there in the first place, they cannot lose this. They lose this round. So they tell you that the primary source was democracy, but they give you no examples, because every example goes to us. In Panama, when we did create a democracy, we were just doing it for control, because the leader was literally our employee. And then cold conceded from case extended through is our Whitson 23 evidence. I'll read from it now. Unfortunately, the fact that advocacy designed to shape U.S. foreign policy on evidence stands little chance against the siren calls of dollars from lobbyists and foreign governments. Forget about weighing. That's the only thing that does the comparative between the intentions. Insofar as in the foreign policy sector, these private sectors has a too overbearing influence, you are going to see that the intention isn't to help the economy and isn't to create democracy, it's just for the private sector. Then, let's go to what they tell you about the economy. No, the United States does not intervene in these places to help the economy, because if they did, in Haiti, they wouldn't have flooded their rice market to where their economy collapsed. And then here's the thesis of our case. Even in all these situations, the United States is always intervening for self-interest, which is cold conceded of warranting again and evidence that they install pliable dictators, whether democratic or authoritarian leaders, that only prefer the United States. When they don't prefer their own people, that's not a reasonable basis. That's not the United States prioritizing the people of that country. But then, even though the weighing is a little redundant when it comes to intentions, we still win it anyway, and our dislat evidence is cold conceded where we tell you this lobbying is a feedback loop. When these companies get more and more control over government, we can't forecast and plan for these basic threats that turn into existential risk, whether it be climate change or anything else. So that's why, to read the resolution is to vote